think people will agree it's great to have sort of concrete facts at your hand. It's brilliant. Now, can we take questions for about 15, 20 minutes? Anyone got anything they would like to ask? Can you use the mic?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I found that really fascinating, so thank you very much. It's been great to see the work that you've done. Is that going to be available online by any chance?
Yeah, so this is kind of new research. It's available in conference papers at the moment, and then it will turn into a journal paper, and then it will end up on the web at some point within this year. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I had to slip off, but I just wondered with some of the social measures, this would seem to be an overlap between what you found and what comes from Wilkinson and Pickett and the spirit level. They're coming from a different direction, but it seems to reinforce the findings that you're coming up with. Is my perception accurate in that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I should now go.
Yeah, the other basic finding is that achieving a low level of inequality, having a more equal society, is more important in wealthy countries than the continued pursuit of economic growth, which is effectively the same thing that comes out of my findings. Yeah, so equality is important.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. One of the slides, a slide which I would like to have seen, I don't know whether you can provide it on another occasion, would be to after you've looked at the biophysical and the social indicators, to go back to the biophysical chart, but to reorder it in the order of the social indicators. I think that would be quite an interesting thing to see. And the other thing I was wondering about, in terms of measuring happiness and sort of trying to find ways of teasing out the zeitgeist of all these different countries, is there some way of trying to assess the kind of the role of the media? In other words, the number of good news stories or the level of advertising, sell, or something like that, as a way of perhaps trying to tease out what people actually think makes them happy. Because, if people are being advertised, being told to buy things, and they have the means to buy those things, then they get a short-term satisfaction sort of loop happening. But of course, that may not actually translate into a real happiness thing. But it might be interesting to see the extent to which the media influences those. It might be another indicator that we teased out. It might be quite revealing, or it might not. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone who's done that, but it certainly doesn't mean that someone hasn't attempted to look at that. I think it would be quite interesting to try and assess what effect advertising has on these sorts of quantities, and maybe how it relates to the results I find here.
Yeah.
If there's any relationship, there might be. There
may be a reason why people think they're happy or think they're not happy, when actually they're happy that they think they are,
yeah.
or less happy than they think they are.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if someone has looked at that at some level, the relationships between.
There is, I've kind of touched on that kind of thing around behaviour and consumption and advertising and the effect of advertising on behaviour and the effect of behaviour.
That's what I'm driving.
On consumption.
Yeah.
But I don't know about to the quantitative extent that you're talking about.
It's a tricky one to know how to go about it, but I'm fairly sure it's quite a big factor.
Because to prove causality, that's why it probably would
I
be.
think, my expectation would, and I think they may talk about this a little bit at the spirit level as well, is that you're sort of, by having advertising and by being constantly exposed to sort of messaging, it generally makes people more dissatisfied with what they have, I think, because it exposes them to an alternative kind of status that they could aspire towards. And so there's, I don't know what you call it, aspirational unhappiness or something to that effect. So, yes, I wouldn't be surprised if there were results.
So the level of press freedom would be a fairly easy one to quantify. I mean, there's a very interesting map, isn't there, with the press freedom thing. I don't know where it's come from, the data's come from, but that's another thing which might be an indicator which could be illuminating if one, and obviously we go on forever with different indicators. But.
And the level of press freedom is actually rolled into my democracy.
Is it? Right.
There is one of the elements of a more democratic society. Yes.
Right.
And then one of the findings actually I didn't talk about, which comes out of this, is there also appears to be a relationship between stable levels of resource use and more democratic societies, which is certainly people in the degrowth movement are very strong advocates of deepening democratic institutions, and that there should be a compatibility between more democratic societies and more environmentally sustainable ones. But I don't think anyone had really tested this against none of these ideas, which seemed, okay, well, this seems good in principle, but my results tend to support that more democratic societies also tend to be ones with more stable levels of resource use and tend to be less growth-oriented. And you can even sort of, in a hand-waving way, think about that if you compare someplace like Switzerland, which has very strong democratic institutions and local democracy, with someplace like China. Switzerland has very low or no levels of growth, and China has very high levels of growth. But that example doesn't demonstrate it, but the statistical analysis does show that there is that relationship there in a wide range of countries.
Okay.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first question was a similar question to Tom's. I mean, how objective is the life satisfaction, level? Because obviously stuff like health, you could say that you can only be so healthy, and then that's it. But it's difficult to say what things bring life satisfaction and what things don't. So, for example, you could say, is a local holiday to Skegness, is that more satisfying than a holiday, to Egypt? How do you? Is there a sort of point you can actually measure these things? It just becomes a sort of choice that people make. In which case, then you have to sort of persuade people that some things aren't satisfying, which is probably quite difficult. The second question, it's a steady state economy 3 years in, but to what extent is a steady state economy different from sustainable development? And because we've had limits to growth in 1972, which led up to sort of Brundtland report 1986, was it 88, which sort of was the sort of defining document of sustainable development. So that's been around for 25 going on 30 years. To what extent is a steady state economy a new concept? How do you differentiate steady state economy from sustainable development and limits to growth?
Okay, I'll answer that one first. The steady state economy idea predates sustainable development. So the steady state economy, well, in theory, it goes back into the 1800s with John Stuart Mill talking about his notion of a stationary state. And so the classical economists talked about this idea, and they viewed it as an inevitability. And Adam Smith even talked about, I think in around 1780 or so, about it being inevitable that we would move towards a stationary state of population and capital. And he estimated that would happen in about 200 years, which is interesting because, it's around the time we are now. Most of the classical economists were very negative about this idea of a stationary state, Adam Smith and Ricardo and so on. Mill was the exception. He viewed it as something positive. He was concerned about the way things were going with industrial development, and he kind of had this idea of sufficiency and economics of enough, in a way, well ahead of his time. Fast forward to the environmental movement in the 1960s, to limits to growth in 1972, and around that same time, Herman Daly sort of resurrected this idea of a stationary state, called it something different, called it a steady state economy. He wrote some papers on it around 1970, and then an edited book in 1973, and then his book Steady State Economics in 1977, which articulated many of the basic ideas of how the economics of this would work. Then we had the idea of sustainable development, right? And so the issue that's happened with sustainable development, I suppose, is that the concept has kind of been watered down to be meaningless now, would be the critique, that it's just become business as usual. And it probably started off as a pretty good idea, and really an idea which was quite similar in a sense to what was being advocated around the idea of a steady state economy. And in fact, in 1996, Daly wrote another book called Beyond Growth, The Economics of Sustainable Development, where he tried to, convince other economists or convince people that a steady state economy was sustainable development, that this was the economics behind it. But it's drifted now more into discourse around green growth and things like this idea that we can continue with the same basic socioeconomic system and the same institutions we have at the moment, and if maybe we can become more efficient, there's a lot of talk about efficiency, then that will be enough to achieve sustainability. And so the degrowth and steady state concepts fundamentally differ, I would say, from sustainable development and green growth and things like that, because they challenge some of these assumptions and these basic institutions that we need to have fairly fundamental changes in the way the economic system works at the moment if we're going to achieve sustainability. And the degrowth people even challenge capitalism. So in general, the steady state people believe that this is possible within a capitalist framework. The degrowth people are more skeptical of that, let's say. So again, that's a bit of a broad brush generalization. Life satisfaction. So the way I measure life satisfaction in these accounts, there were sort of two indicators along those lines. There was my health indicator, which is an objective indicator. It's healthy life expectancy, measures how many years people can expect to live in good health. So quite an objective indicator. The other one is not objective at all. It's called subjective well-being. And in that sort of indicator, you just ask people, on a scale of 0 to 10, how happy are you with your life in general these days? 7. And this seems a bit wishy-washy maybe, and economists are certainly critical of this at first, but there's very good evidence now of the robustness of this indicator, or the set of subjective well-being indicators, and that it conveys meaningful information. So again, you could take your family who went on holiday in Egypt and your other family who went on holiday in Skegness, and you can just ask them how happy they are. Maybe you find that the family that went on vacation in Egypt is happy, or maybe they had a bad time there. Who knows? And they're less happy. But effectively, you don't try and judge or guess or explain in a sense. You just simply ask people. And how do we know this information is meaningful? How do we know this isn't just completely random scatter? Well, we can do various tests. We can ask your friends. We can say, if we ask your friends how happy they think you are, Dan, what response do they get? And in general, we find that the results that your friends say correlate very well with what you say, which is interesting, and lends some support to this idea. And it also, if you think about it, it would be hard for our societies to function if we weren't sort of aware of these sorts of issues at some level. If you question the subjective nature of this indicator, though, we can strap some electrodes onto your head. We know the areas of the brain associated with positive feelings. We know the areas associated with negative feelings, and we can measure the activity in different parts of the brain associated with these activities. And what we find is, again, that people who say they're happy are on these 0 to 10 scales. Those parts of their brain associated with happiness light up more than people who say things on the lower end of the scale. And there's been a variety of other sort of tests that have attempted to show the legitimacy of these indicators. And so they're now becoming more and more accepted by the mainstream community.
2 more questions to finish just after 9:30. And then Lorna.
So, what the work that you've done here, where can that go? I mean, you could wave a magic wand. What difference can this make, and how can it make a difference?
Well, sure.
From your work, what's the size of Cuba's footprint? I'm we assume it's close to 1 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And were there one or 2 other countries that you indicated might be around that? And the other thing was, in your other talk that you do about policies that bring countries towards sustainability, what are the key policies that indicate, that move countries towards that kind of situation?
So start with Cuba, I guess. It does tend to pop up in these sorts of analyses of sustainability. So does Costa Rica. It generally comes out as being a country with fairly low environmental footprint and fairly high performance on social indicators. It also has no army, which is interesting. What are the key policies? Well, there's this sort of work that we did around Enough is Enough, obviously, about the policies that we need to stabilize resource use, stabilize population, reduce inequality, reform the monetary system. various other, bits and pieces, which is a bit different from this work, which is more sort of a quantitative assessment of these different countries. And
But did you say you were looking at some place like Cuba or
Yeah.
Costa Rica? Would you be saying, well, they've got a free family planning service, they've got very good health service, you can abortion on demand? I don't know what it is, but
yeah.
it would be those sorts of things. Would it?
Yeah, and to be honest, I haven't really looked at that. I haven't gone to the level of saying, let's have a detailed analysis of these particular countries and see what's happening. There are a few things which have sort of fallen out of the analysis, like in terms of the unemployment stuff. So Japan, for instance, having this different culture and business. Germany implementing working time reduction as a way of dealing with unemployment, for instance. And so those kind of fall out of that particular analysis. But this is really what in academia we call an opportunity for future research, in the sense that these findings, create more questions, right? How have some of these countries managed to do this? How have they managed to perform well on these particular indicators? And so, if one were going to follow this up, that's the sort of thing which you look at, and which I will inevitably dig into more. To take some of the countries that do particularly well on these indicators and try and figure out why. Because it's the first stage of this assessment is to say how close are countries to a steady-state economy and to establish some of these relationships. But then it's to figure out how they do that and what does that tell us about the kinds of policies we recommend in Enough is Enough. In Enough is Enough, we're quite concerned about the relationship between growth and unemployment. We have a whole chapter on employment saying that we need working time reduction and a job guarantee and other things to deal with the predicted side effects of not having growth. But here in my analysis, it seems that that's not such a problem, right? And so again, these findings in some ways challenge some of the things I've written in earlier places. Or do they? Is it that these countries are already implementing the kinds of policies that we propose, and that's how they decouple this? Is it a natural process, what's happening in these countries, or are they making some active attempt? They know that employment's going to increase unless they do something, and so let's have working time reduction, or individual firms are making some particular choices. But at least, I think it suggests that the problem is not as worrisome as we might think. That clearly, even if we're not making this active goal and setting out, okay, we need X, Y, and Z before we try and do this, those have to be in place, otherwise it's going to be a catastrophe. Well, things are sorting themselves out to some extent, in some countries at least.
But isn't it with 4 pounds? That it's steady, it's stable, but it's
At a level of resources which is too high, and so that is fundamentally problematic. But there are some of these countries with lower levels of resources,
so
like
hence
Cuba,
it's-
like Kyrgyzstan is another one I didn't show, I think, which does quite well. So again, how much of that is a product of its level of resource use, and how much is a product of other factors? Hard to say.
But you did say, didn't you, on your scatter diagrams that on average, I think both of them just showed, suggested a 3.5 planet use.
times resource use.
So if
Yeah.
that's true,
Yeah.
and I'm sure it is, I don't know where the UK is on the previous one, but I think the world wasn't, that's suggesting 3.5 is the answer.
Yeah, on
The
average.
previous slide showed less than that, didn't it?
Previous slide for,
That.
we're talking about this.
But that's scale of resource use rather than the...
Where's, sorry,
Yeah.
what's the, I can't see in the red world figure, what is it?
1.5, so
Yes.
50% higher.
So what, the slide that comes after that suggests that actually the right answer is 3.5, but the current use is 1.5.
Right, so this analysis on this slide here is attempting to show what level of resource use is needed for a sufficient level of social performance. And so the other slide, at the moment in the world, our level of resource use is 1.5 times the sustainable level, according to the footprint. And that's in an unequal world where some countries have a high level of social performance and others have a very low level. If we wanted to have all countries in the world, at a level of resource use that achieves a 7 out of 10 on life satisfaction, for instance, then we need to be using 3.5 times.
Yeah.
And so, it's a conflict between social sustainability and environmental sustainability. That's what's coming out of this.
Can we just end with this question, which was where now? Where does this take you?
Yeah, what difference can it all make?
Yes.
Well, there's a couple things. In a practical sense, one of the things we argue for in the book is new meanings and measures of progress, which is effectively what I've tried to do here, to create a different way of looking at the economy based on its environmental qualities and its social performance. Saying, what are the things we want in a steady-state economy? Stable resource use within environmental limits. Okay, let's measure that. And what's the other thing we want? High level of social performance, as measured by health and equality and social capital and things like that. And so let's measure those things, right? So national statistical agencies, in general, measure many of the things that I've put up here. The problem is we don't really take them into account in decision making. We look at GDP and what's happening to GDP, and we kind of ignore the rest of this information. And so we need to change that. I would argue that we would be better off if we simply threw away GDP. It's not a particularly good indicator of anything, and we have necessary information to manage the economy without GDP, and we can probably manage it in a better way. Now, that's maybe a bit of an extreme statement. There are GDP is just a number, and if we were able to not take it quite so seriously, we could probably have it in with the other indicators. But the problem is, as soon as it's in there, we just ignore everything else. And so it would be an interesting experiment to just say, okay, this next year or this next decade, no one's allowed to look at GDP. Let's attempt to manage the economy with these other indicators that we have and see what happens. And I guess my argument would be that we would make better decisions if we did that. So there's that argument of changing how we measure progress. Then there's the argument of, okay, with these new measures of progress, we get different policy implications that come out of this, and like the findings around unemployment, like the findings around democracy and stability and things like that, and that we should use that information, and we should celebrate the countries which are closer to a steady state economy, and be holding those up as our goal of where we want to go towards, as opposed to celebrating the growth economies as we do at the moment.
I think you might say what I was asking, what you said. I mean, what I'm saying is, how can what you've done actually make the difference? I mean, what are the structures? Who's going to listen to that and who's going to act on it? It's more like that sort of question.
Yeah.
So ideally, if you could have it, where would this work go? How would it impact? How would it have an impact?
It would be it would form part of the system of national accounts, basically, that we use to measure the progress of economies, and politicians would be looking at these sorts of indicators and looking at the impact of given policies on these indicators. Is the indicator improving human well-being? Is it lowering inequality? Is it reducing resource use, for instance? And policies would be assessed in that sort of context, as opposed to just, is this policy increasing GDP?
Would that be like civil servants taking this on, or what do you think?
Well,
I'm asking.
yeah, I think what Maria is saying is, what would your next step be to advertise this? Because what you're saying is that maybe politicians will look at it. Will they look at it because they're into a steady state?
Yeah.
Or will they just be, well, what would their motive be? But where is your next step in order to develop your work and to push it?
It's the French conference.
Yeah, okay. So I guess two things. I can tell you what I will do next.
Yes.
This stuff will be published. The results will be published in some pretty tables, which will be put on the website, and which will be promoted in the media. And so the media loves league tables. And so there's this is sort of only part of this work. We also have league tables based on how close different countries are to a steady state economy, things that the media likes. We'll publish those and try and put some stuff in the Guardian in the same way. There'll be little stories about this. And so hopefully that will, again, draw attention of policymakers to this different way of measuring progress. And so I can sort of tell you what those stories will look like. It'll be something like, okay, here's this economist, the steady state guy, and he says there's a different way of measuring the progress of economies, and oh look, Japan comes out on top, not the US or China. And so why is that? And, you know, so again, it just tries to get into the discussion that there's different ways of looking at the progress of economies. The Happy Planet Index is another attempt to do something like that. I think Costa Rica generally comes out near the top of that. It's very efficient at translating resource use into well-being, basically. And so it gets some of these ideas, hopefully, into
So it's like consciousness raising.
yeah, and so it's part of that. But again, if you have any ideas on the best way to proceed, then let me know. Another thing that what Lauren is referring to is what's happening in France, this event at the National Assembly, which is being organized by IDRI, the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations, which is part government, part academic institution. And so they're bringing together a lot of interesting people, people from the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, members of parliament, and then people like myself who are sort of pushing for these kinds of economic reforms. And the messaging behind the conference is that growth is evaporating, is starting to disappear in wealthy countries, and we need to do something about it. And there will certainly be people there, I'm sure, who are arguing that okay, we need to get growth going again, and growth is not going to disappear. There'll be other people who are arguing for green growth, and then there'll be people like myself who are saying we need a different economic approach, which puts different measures of progress forward. And so I'm very interested to see what's going to happen in this kind of forum. It's a bit of an experiment, and maybe French MPs will listen, and maybe they won't. But again, I think in France at the moment, there's a bit of a panic on the part of the administration. François Hollande is not doing particularly well, and I think there is an interest at least in looking at different approaches. Whether that will gain any traction or not, ask me again in the middle of July, and we'll see what actually comes out of that. But hopefully something good. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Dan.